Welcome. I'm James Brousseau. This is the Wealth Inequality Workshop. What we're going to be exploring here is the philosophy and ethics of wealth and its distribution. We'll start by asking about theoretical equality, and then experiment with some of the compromises and sacrifices that have to be made in the real world if we're going to spread wealth evenly. There'll also be questions about money and freedom. We'll be asking how wealth accumulation can twist individual freedom back against itself, and whether there's any route to coexistence between the two. Finally, above all that, there's the overarching question, which is, how do philosophical stances end up converting into the justification for one or another profile of wealth's distribution? So that's where we're headed. We're going to be appealing to central philosophers and philosophical theories to think about wealth inequality. Before starting, though, two quick points. First, this approach is very different from other significant ways of discussing the issue, which are in terms of economics, psychology, and politics. In the briefest terms, we can say that economics is about the financial causes of inequality, and psychology is about emotional responses to it, and politics is about how power interacts with it. And then, as apart from all that, what we're going to be maneuvering through is the divergent ways that ethical values shape wealth and its distribution. So that's one point. The other is that this won't be about taking sides or getting in the last word. There are no last words in philosophy, and regardless, this isn't about settling the wealth inequality debate. It's about exploring what's going on underneath the debate.
Wealth inequality. It can be gauged as a personal reality, or mapped as a social condition. No matter how it's conceived, there's a gulf between the wealthy and the rest, and it's significant. Debates about the divide occur on three levels. The question will be asked here in terms of philosophical ethics. The ethical dilemma is fundamentally a tension between two values: equality and freedom. Valuing equality means resisting wealth imbalances, even at the cost of individual liberty. Privileging freedom implies respecting individual rights, even when that means accepting wealth differences. Between these two, everyone eventually will have to make their own decision. And while there are no right or wrong responses, there definitely are better, and worse, understandings of what the decision means. Tracing the contours of the dilemma starts with equality. There are three variations of this ethics, and the first is direct. Everyone the same. It's easy to envision this kind of society. Families occupy indistinguishable apartments. Every Friday they receive an identical bundle of necessities and luxuries: bread, clothing, wine, chocolate. The ethical demand for equality is satisfied. But there's an intrinsic problem. Sooner or later someone is going to want more wine. And someone who likes chocolate is going to make a trade. Immediately, there are two outcomes. First, while a few people benefit, no one loses. So it's very difficult for anyone to complain. Second, even though no one loses, inequality begins. It's inevitable, because some people getting ahead means that others fall behind. The technical term for this dynamic is a Pareto efficiency. And the point is that straight equality won't endure when people with different desires engage in free exchange. Consequently, if an egalitarian pattern of wealth distribution is going to be maintained, then either different desires, or free exchange, will need to be prohibited. And prohibitions require enforcers. But this implies that equality is already gone. It's ruined because the enforcers are getting their way, while others aren't. This internal contradiction in the egalitarian world can be papered over. One reliable strategy is to call the enforcers first among equals. Intellectually, this may be smooth. But it won't feel that way for the second among equals. For those who live on the wrong end of the directives, and of the controls.
So what's critical here is that the ideal of pure equality is unsustainable. Not for some external reason, but because of an internal contradiction. If the world is composed of distinct people with unique desires, then there's just no way to hold direct equality together. What that means then is that to implement equality in the material world, we're going to have to experiment with different ways of allowing inequality but only is subjected to or conditioned by the higher ideal of equality.
The difficulty with maintaining pure equality in the real world leads to a second, and more flexible version of egalitarian ethics. The primary advocate is John Rawls. His difference principle states, social and economic inequalities are ethically justified if, and only if, they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Here's how the principle translates as politics.
His name was Hubert H. Humphrey, and he set forth a moral test for our country. He said the moral test of a nation is how it treats people who are in the shadows of life, people who are poor, unfortunate, and really struggling.
More abstractly, here are 4 societies. Within the rule of the difference principle, which one is ethically preferable? It's going to be C, because people are allowed to engage in a world of economic exchanges that are mutually beneficial. But no one may get ahead at the expense of the neediest. So, to save the egalitarian ideal, Rawls makes 2 changes to pure equality. First, he realigns the idea of equality with the imperative that no one may be left behind. Second, he allows wealth imbalance, as strictly controlled, into society. In theory, this idea works. There's a problem in practice though. What happens if there are a few members of a society who swallow up all generosity, and convert it to misery? For example, a heroin addict may consume tremendous resources. There are methadone clinics to establish, and hospital stays to cover. Homeless shelters need to be constructed. All that is expensive, and the money has to come from somewhere. No doubt some will be subtracted from the luxuries of the 1%. But some will also detract from those waving the signs of the 99%. And, in the end, no matter how much is spent to rescue the addicted, there will always be those who fall back into the drugs, and into the need. Finally, the problem with the difference principle is that it holds the entire society hostage to the Sisyphean task of rehabilitating the least fortunate. When equality means that no one gets ahead unless the poorest of the poor do, then the bottom 1% ends up holding the rest to infinite ransom.
So what we have here is the kind of problem that tends to emerge when abstract theories hit the real world. In the abstract, the difference principle sounds functional. If we're evaluating equality, then privileging the least fortunate, even at a significant cost to the rest, is fine. But the breakdown comes at the extreme where the least advantaged aren't only less productive of wealth, but aggressively counterproductive. Say, through addiction or something comparable. Now, none of this leads to irrationality. It's perfectly coherent to affirm that everyone has to be held back until the least fortunate get ahead. And this may actually happen in reality. For example, in the military, if a member of a retreating platoon is injured, the rest may refuse to leave it behind. So again, this way of valuing equality is functional. But it's also true that within the difference principle, equality cashes out in the real world as a kind of dictatorship of the poverty-stricken. It's the threat that the least advantaged will refuse to advance, and then no one else goes either. And finally, to round this off theoretically, the intellectual hesitation is that it's the idea of equality itself which is raising up this counterintuitive dictatorship threat. It's the idea of treating people the same which ends up granting the smallest minority power over everyone else.
This drawback in the difference principle leads to a third version of equality ethics. Utilitarian theory was pioneered by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Together, they argued that the ethically right act was always the one bringing the greatest good and happiness to the greatest number of people. There's a happiness calculation at the core of this idea. It counts the felicity of every member of society, and seeks to maximize the total. Importantly, no one person weighs proportionally more, or less, in the calculation. The rich, poor, and everyone else are simply stacked up, their happiness is counted, and the higher the total, the better. Which means the ethics of equality can go forward, without getting tied down and held back by any lagging individual, or marginal group. As an example, given these societies, D is the preference. When you account for every individual's reality, add them together, and then draw conclusions exclusively from the total, it's clear that the greater wealth of the vast majority justifies the slight decline of the very few. While it's undeniable that wealth disparities are growing, it also seems that the losses on the lower end are minimal, at least as compared with the wealth and happiness increases spread through the economy's vast middle and upper segments. So, the argument can be made that the theory is holding on to a reasonable degree of financial egalitarianism. Still, a worry is rising. It's that if we keep going down this line, then, eventually, the strength of the commitment to equality is going to come into question. How about when we reach Society E? Does the still greater total wealth for almost everyone justify the few's drastic impoverishment? For the staunch utilitarian, it looks like the answer may have to be yes. But that's only true if total money in society exactly equals total happiness. In reality, it doesn't. At least not if the law of diminishing marginal utility holds. The intuitive idea here is that the more and better you get of something, the less good it feels. So, when you're thirsty, the first gulp of water satisfies more than the second. And, when two people are thirsty, you generate more total happiness by giving both a glass of tap water than you do by giving one a bottle of expensive French Perrier while leaving the other parched. If that's right, then the ethics of utilitarianism tends toward an equal society. Concretely, it's impossible to justify one person having the money to buy a Rolls-Royce, while others have no car, because the happiness generated by two people with Buicks is greater than the satisfaction of one with a Rolls. Here's how that point sounds when it's made in the real world.
Well, you're in the 1%, and we're in the 99%.
What? Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question.
So that these folks
Hold on.
could pay their student
Let me ask you a
loans,
question.
could get off of food stamps, could be successful.
Let me ask you a question.
Just
Wait,
like you.
wait.
What are you
Hold on.
driving?
Hold on.
They don't have a
Hold on.
car.
The rule is that when you have very little, it doesn't cost much to create happiness. And, when you have a lot, adding pleasure gets expensive. If that's right, then wealth should be transferred from the rich to everyone else, because that maximizes total well-being. Now taking this back to the diagrammed societies, wealth disparities may be sanctioned even within an ethics of equality, but the imbalances can only go so far. The value of equality will still be functioning because the desire for the highest total happiness combines with the law of diminishing marginal utility. And together they actively resist those extreme imbalances that end up diminishing cumulative well-being. The ethics works to aggressively pull hyper-concentrated wealth back across the entire collective. The initial conclusion is that utilitarianism justifies wealth redistribution, and serves the ideal of equality. There remains a single problem though. It resembles the difficulty resolved by the law of marginal utility, but it's more remote. And, ultimately, also more toxic. What do you do when faced with this choice? Importantly, what's going on here is not that the poverty of a few is found to be acceptable because everyone else is doing so well. Instead, it's that the active and imposed suffering of a very few, at the distant end of the wealth spectrum, actually provides abundant happiness for the rest. According to the rational utilitarian calculation, just like you'll take from the rich, in the name of total welfare, so too you'll take from the least fortunate in the name of the same general good. The ends justify the means. All that matters is maximizing overall happiness. In the real world, one plausible scenario for executing this utilitarian sacrifice starts in a hospital. Elderly patients may have public money for their care withdrawn once they've reached a predetermined age. For those who don't have the cash in their own bank accounts to make the payments, quick death ensues. That's a subtraction in the utilitarian ledger. But, on the beneficial side, there's also going to be more organs harvested for younger, healthier patients. The sacrifice is a few months of life stripped away from a few unwell geriatrics, and, in return, there are multiple transplants for younger men and women whose lives resurge. In essence, this is wealth redistribution. It just moves in the opposite direction. Instead of taxing the richest in the name of the 99%, we're taking from a very few and miserable lives, to serve the rest. Finally, this utilitarian sacrifice comes in multiple variations. For instance, it might be that developing a disease remedy is facilitated by subjecting a few unwitting indigents to lethal medical experiments.
To do the work, we need human subjects. then most of them will die.
If you could cure cancer by killing one person, wouldn't you have to do that?
Yes. But it's also true that the ideal of equality is losing some of its luster. Concluding. There are 3 degrees of equality ethics. 1. Straight. Everyone the same. The problem here is that we'll never all be the same. 2. Rawls and the difference principle form a society that won't let the wealthy stretch away from everyone else. The problem here is that standing up for the least fortunate also means holding everyone else back. 3. Utilitarian distribution, bringing the greatest good to the greatest number, should reduce the gap between the 1% and the rest. The problem here is that redistribution in the name of the general good works just as well from the bottom as it does from the top.
So, looking at these 3 ways of valuing equality, we saw that the idealized version, pure equality, couldn't work for internal reasons, and that left 2 viable options: the difference principle and utilitarianism. On the difference principle side, it makes sense to privilege the least fortunate even when it costs everyone else. But there's no way to ensure that equalizing generosity doesn't end up as extortion or a kind of dictatorship of the impoverished. Then, thinking about utilitarianism, we can privilege the mainstream, and in most circumstances, this way of valuing equality is going to redistribute wealth at least somewhat evenly across most of society. But there's a risk here too. It falls on individuals, whether they're privileged or disadvantaged or somewhere in between, and it's that the cost of equality may become personally exorbitant. In the extreme case, it would even be that dedication to equality leads to the conclusion that some individuals must sacrifice their lives in the name of well-being for everyone else, say for a medical experiment that promised to cure lethal disease. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. It makes sense theoretically as a way of incarnating the value of equality. And then in the real world, it does happen. Think of the Tuskegee medical experiments. So we may be able to accept the idea that one will be sacrificed for everyone else. But what's difficult inside this particular use of utilitarianism is that the justification is the ideal of equality. It's precisely because we demand equality that one or a few get separated out and sacrificed. Finally, going back to the difference principle, the problem there was that at the extreme, a very few received too much deference. And here, the problem is again out at the extreme, and also with a very few, but it's too little deference.
Apart from equality, there is ethics as valuing freedom. It starts with the libertarian principle. Do what you like, up to the point where you interfere with others doing the same. This is a theory of freedom maximization, and one of those who embraced the value is Robert Nozick. He is known for a specific thought experiment. It begins with a society where everyone is equally wealthy. The scenario's point is to box inequality advocates. They're forced to start from a pattern of wealth distribution that they can't find objectionable. Next, step 2. The great NBA superstar of his time, Wilt Chamberlain, proposes a new contract with his team. The ticket price for every home game will go up $5, and that money goes directly to him. 3. The team owners reply no. So Chamberlain threatens to quit, and they change their mind. 4. Some season ticket holders cancel their purchase, but most agree that it's worth the extra money to see the superstar play. 5. About 20,000 people fit in the arena, where Chamberlain plays 41 games a year. 6. He pockets an extra $4,100,000 annually. The result is disconcertingly imbalanced wealth in this once egalitarian society. In economic terms, the objection may come that the extreme inequality distorts the marketplace and creates inefficiencies. Psychologically, people may despise the newly rich, while others dread the rising tide of envy. But ethically, is there any objection? It's hard to locate. There were no complaints at the start. And as society evolved, everyone made their own choices. Above all, no force was employed, or even implied. There was no coercion. Which means no one's freedom was violated. And for that reason, there's no solid ground for complaint about how we ended up in a world where some people are stars, and others aren't. There simply can't be legitimate objections because, within the ethics of freedom maximization, saying that no one's freedom has been violated, is no different from determining that whatever happened, was ethically justified. The conclusion is that freedom as the highest value dissolves ethical complaints about wealth inequality in society. Further, if someone does complain, if they say Chamberlain shouldn't have proposed the new contract, or the owners shouldn't have agreed to it, or the spectators shouldn't have ponied up the extra money, then, at bottom, what's that? Isn't the complaint really a plea for coercion? It seems so. If people aren't going to be allowed free rein to make their own decisions and pursue their own desires, their autonomy is violated. So, actively blocking the emergence of wealth inequality finds no ethical justification. Next, the logic expands from prohibitions to corrections. It's not just that there's a problem with prohibiting people from acting independently to accumulate wealth, there's also a problem with intervening afterward to undo the free actions. Concretely, after individuals become rich, a tax may be proposed to redistribute wealth toward a more balanced state. And, if everyone freely agrees, that's fine. But at the moment one person says no, cooperation shifts back into coercion. No matter how satisfying the redistribution proposal may be, what is perceived on the ethical level is that people's own initiatives and accomplishments are getting reversed and oppressed. Unjustly. In the end, it's not only that the ethics of freedom allows wealth inequality. It also debilitates the remedies of the egalitarians.
Concluding this, the reasoning is solid and hard to stop once you buy the premise. Once you begin doing ethics from the privileging of freedom as the highest value, then you're committed to the possibility of people gathering in arenas or on Wall Street and accumulating fortunes. So, at least in direct terms, wealth concentration, even the most extreme concentration, is conceived as ethically unassailable. There's no way to challenge those who have more than we do. There's no way to say it's ethically bankrupt. But that's not the end. As was the case with the value of equality, the relations between freedom and wealth imbalances are multiple.
A final question remains. Is there any ethical stand that can be taken against a society where 1% corrals a third of the money? For libertarian ethics, the only way to answer affirmatively is to assert that wealth inequality has converted into a threat to freedom. The situation, in other words, is delicate. On one hand, human freedom expresses itself as individuals going their own way. On the other, people going their own way means some get ahead, while others fall behind, and that outcome may end up impeding the same freedom that got everything started. So, the ethical charge against wealth inequality would be that the autonomy of the fortune hunters has gone too far. The economic imbalance they're creating is restricting opportunities for others. The technical term for this dynamic is an excess economy, which is one where a potential, or a force, or a desire, first surges. Then it twists back and destroys itself. As an example, think of smoking. One cigarette today leads to two tomorrow, and then goes out of control until, finally, the smoker's diseased body expires. What's pertinent here is that it's the desire to smoke that twists back and kills the desire to smoke. The desire is excessive, in the sense that it suffocates itself. And, returning to the main subject, the analogy is that just as smoking burns itself out, so too free action in the open marketplace twists back, and then suffocates freedom more generally. That's the insinuation in this exchange.
You should want to share your success, but you started out with 2 clients before you had 20,000. You should want to help the next guy.
I am helping the next guy. I'm helping them. I'm helping my clients by giving them services that they want. I'm employing 150 people. How many people do you employ?
I'm in the mortgage business. I wish I employed 150 people.
Well, let's stop. Well, go do it.
The problem is
I'm doing it. I'm doing my share. Why aren't you doing yours?
Everything depends on the answer. Inside libertarianism, the only objection to wealth inequality that commands respect is the claim that those who have accumulated fortunes are impeding others from doing the same. Perhaps the case could be made that members of the 1% embrace cronyism. opportunities are only traded and whispered among an established elite. If that's right, then the independence of some is limiting and impeding others. Wealth inequality, which was originally a sign of freedom, becomes a symptom of oppression. So, the philosophical and ethical question comes into focus. Are we free individuals in an open marketplace? Or has freedom gotten out of control and become self-destructive?
Breaking in here, this is the central idea of one of the 20th century's pivotal philosophers and economists. Or actually, it's two ideas. First, there's the proposal of an excess economy, which is any system of exchange that feeds on its own satisfaction, that in a sense always needs more because it's already had too much. Just as a rudimentary example, this would be something like a brainstorming session. One person has a good idea, and that sparks two more from others, and it keeps accelerating. The more you have, the more you get. Added to that then, and this is one of the problems with brainstorming, is that it doesn't tend toward a close or a stop or an equilibrium. There's no single answer at the end. There can't be. Because if it's a good brainstorming session, the best answer is always the one that leads to still more answering. In general, excess is like that. There's something diabolical in it, in a situation where the best tries to get to an answer or a conclusion are the very ones that most increase the distance to any answer or any conclusion. In any case, and back on freedom in the economic world, the application of excess there more or less coheres with an ideal version of liberal capitalism. It implies that individual opportunity leads to the development of products and services that in turn creates still more opportunities, and so on. So, under this conception, freedom and wealth dovetail and accelerate, and then that acceleration leads to still more. And going to the conclusion, the point is that freedom, opportunity, and wealth in the economic world can participate in this excess economy. So, I said Bataille introduced two ideas to the West. The first is excess. The second is a very particular kind of collapse or implosion. It comes when excess spins so fast and so out of control that it overwhelms or explodes the entire process of production. And that was the example with cigarettes, where the desire for one today leads to two tomorrow and on up to a pack a day and then more, until your lungs rot out and you literally can't inhale. So, excess can overwhelm itself. And for Bataille, the name for this excessive element that ultimately overwhelms its own production is the accursed element, or the accursed part. Now, this leads us back to the question, is freedom in the economic world cursed? Is it going to burn itself out?
The question has been investigated by Gilles Deleuze. In his language, the pure kind of freedom which makes space for others is called potency. It is expansive and catalyzing. At the other extreme, the kind of freedom which twists back against itself and oppresses is called power.
En revanche, la joie, c'est l'effectuation d'une puissance. Encore une fois, je ne connais pas de puissance qui soit méchante. Ce qui est mauvais, c'est pas la méchanceté, c'est empêcher quelqu'un d'effectuer sa puissance. La confusion du pouvoir et de la puissance, elle est ruineuse parce que le pouvoir sépare toujours les gens qui sont soumis de ce qu'ils peuvent.
So, freedom expressed as potency is catalyzing, while freedom expressed as power separates people from what they can do. Fleshing this out, here are two examples from the economic world. First, the finance corporation Goldman Sachs construes its brand as a narrative of potency. Here's how they articulate the idea.
I asked the NCAA why there were no first and second round men's and women's tournaments in Louisville. They said, unless you build one downtown, we don't need to come to Louisville. Where there's a will, there's a way.
It was how do you put together a package and a financing that investors will have faith in and ultimately buy and believe in the future growth of downtown Louisville and the ability of this arena to generate revenues.
This arena will change the economic vitality of the city of Louisville.
The growth of this company has just been tremendous.
All of these buildings will be renovated.
I've managed to get all the shifts I need and work as much as I want.
That was an idealized narrative, created originally to promote a corporate image. But, It's also a clear vision of what potency looks like in the marketplace. Independence fuels opportunities. And while there's no doubt that the Goldman financiers in white shirts and blue ties are getting astronomically more money out of this economic engine than the waitress, there's still no ethical objection. There can't be, because no one's freedom is being constrained as the arena goes up. If anything, it's the opposite. On the other side, Goldman Sachs is more than an engine of potential. It is also an institution of power, which means oppression. It's a kind of machine where freedom gets out of control. It twists back and consumes itself by separating individuals from what they can do. Here's an example.
We arrive at the meeting at 5 p.m. It's the Friday before the Memorial Day 3-day weekend, and guess what? We are sitting there waiting. A couple guys left. Okay, when the guy showed up at 10 o'clock, 5 hours late, he passed around an attendance sheet. And he said, the lesson today is about waiting for people that are more important than you. And he said, someday there'll be a billionaire you need to get to. He's going to make you wait in his lobby. Okay, you need to be conditioned for that. And then he got up and he left.
And what happened to those new hires who left early? They were promptly fired.
In the meeting room, there was no coercion in the sense that we normally understand the term. No one was prohibited from walking out the door. Still, there was a draining of human potency. First, there were the hours wasted as people sat aimlessly waiting. Then came the withering lesson that success requires servility. Finally, those few who refused to see their potential ridiculed were fired. If anything, within the ethics of freedom, it's the ones who stayed who should have been fired. Regardless of who loses their job, the ethical problem with the 10 p.m. meeting is not that employees were told something that wasn't true. Everyone knows, or should know, that Wall Street is for sharks. The problem is that the allure of hyperwealth has twisted human freedom against itself. The desire to make a fortune is no longer about creating opportunities, but destroying them. Instead of being vitalizing and liberating, the money becomes sad and domineering.
What's going on here is that Deleuze is providing us with a way to resist some, but not all, kinds of wealth inequality. And it's not because there's something intrinsically wrong with a society where 1% of the people hoard half the resources. That imbalance has nothing to do with it. All that matters for Deleuze is what he calls potential, which is the specific kind of freedom that opens more of itself to others, as opposed to wrapping back and extinguishing itself. The conclusion is that the value of freedom is neither for nor against wealth inequality, but it's a kind of watershed, a divider that accelerates some types of wealth accumulation while turning others back against themselves.
In the end, there are 3 contact points between freedom ethics and wealth inequality. The accumulation and possession of vast riches is justified. Attempts to rebalance wealth in society through common redistribution mechanisms, and in the name of equality, are revealed as unjustifiable scenes of coercion. Wealth accumulation stops being justified when it represses freedom. The broad result is, no direct ethical argument may be leveled against a society where a small percentage of individuals hoards a large share of the money. Nevertheless, an indirect argument may be mounted. If, and only if, it can be shown that wealth inequality is no longer a sign of expanding freedom, and instead has become a symptom of oppression, then, the conclusion is that wealth concentration must be alleviated. Finally, the general conclusion to the question about wealth inequality on the level of philosophy and ethics. There are 2 irreconcilable approaches. Like the difference between a painter and a musician, neither is right nor wrong. They only conceive the world in different ways. That's why, ultimately, there can't be any debate between them, only a decision. Those who value equality most highly are willing to sacrifice individual freedom for the collective's economic unity. The task that remains is to implement their conception of justice. There are 3 possibilities. They can try to enforce straight equality, by making everyone the same. But this proves difficult in a world of divergent individuals. They can use Rawls and the difference principle. This allows people to go their own way, and some will get ahead. Almost everyone is held back though, because the principle dictates that no one may be left behind. Finally, The utilitarian option maximizes total well-being within an egalitarian framework for mainstream society. But, out on the margins, there's jeopardy. Those who value freedom are willing to sacrifice economic equality so that individuals may live unconstrained lives. The task that remains is to determine whether emerging wealth inequality is a symbol of expanding freedom, or the symptom of oppressive power that separates individuals from what they can do.
Finally, those are the basic philosophical and ethical approaches to wealth inequality. On the equality side, there's the proposal that wealth imbalances are intrinsically objectionable. And if that's right, then what remains to figure out is how to make the abstract value of economic equality actually function in our material world. The other approach isn't the opposite, it's more tangential. It's the idea that decisions about wealth and distribution won't be made in terms of the money people have. Instead, they'll be made in terms of how wealth imbalances affect the higher value of freedom. And then going one step further, the key difference on this side is between the two distinct kinds of freedom. One that's vital, it generates potential, opportunities, joy. The other is oppressive, it's restricting, sad.